Hello, everybody. Welcome to the third episode of my series, Steps in Getting Better at Art. So, first, you have to choose 5 colors of different shades. Start off with the base color, and then you move on with lower value but higher saturation. Next, I would like you to pick 2 separate colors, one for highlight and the other one for a slightly more saturated tone, so perhaps a lilac or lavender, which I will show you later on. First off, you have to make the sphere using the circular select object. Start off with the base color, and I would like you to choose the first shading color and shade the top half of the sphere. And just clean up the sides over there. Try to make sure the shading follows the curvature of the sphere, since this is a third episode which focuses on coloring textures for metal or metallic objects for that matter. Next off is your second and third shading color. Try to follow the same direction of strokes, and for this stage it's fine to erase and recolor it, and try to make sure that the shadings are all in different layers so it's easier for you to adjust. Next, I use my first shading color, colored using an airbrush from the bottom up, so there's a gradient. Next off is the highlights, using the color in the middle. As for the highlights, I recommend using a color that's significantly brighter, but with less saturation. And the reason why I put the highlights right next to the darkest shadow you've shaded before is to show contrast. Since different textures have different ways of rendering, since we're going for a smoother metallic feel, the highlights will definitely have a big contrast with the shadows. You can adjust it afterwards. If you like it's not as good, I added more highlights to show that the metallic ball is more of a gloss type of metal rather than a matte texture. So next off is to use the lavender color, following the gradient from the bottom up. This will show more depth in the shading. As you can see, in one of the few layers, I used a color picker and try to adjust the shading within the sphere to show a little bit more contrast between the highlights and the shadows. As the few brush strokes that are a bit lighter than the shading, is to show that there are different light sources in the background. I added a soft brush between the borders of the highlights and shadows to show better reflection. And then you're done for the metallic sphere. Now, as for metals, there are different kinds of textures, as I've mentioned previously. The top one is more of a matte type, while we're trying to go for an approach similar to the second object, as I've shown you. More of a stainless steel type of object. And the third one is a little bit more rough, as you can see. Now for the next step, I'm just tracing this cylinder here so we can start with the color blocking. For this one, it's more of a brushed aluminum, I guess. A brushed aluminum type of material, and it definitely looks more difficult than the previous one. Start off with the base color as usual. Then I used an ellipse selection tool to separate the top face from the rest of the cylinder. As you can see from the reference, the top face does not have any shading. It's just one singular color. Now start using your first shading color, which is the second color from the palette, and start shading using an airbrush. Do the same in a second layer using the second shading color. Now the shading color is respective to the name of the layers, the clipping layers, as you can see. Next off with the third shading color. Going up and down strokes using a soft brush at first and then erasing it using an airbrush. In the early stages, it's really difficult on trying to make the cylinder as accurate as possible. So just try different type of strokes if you can to see if it matches the reference. Next for the highlights and the slightly light blue color. As you can see in the reference, there are multiple streaks of different colors. I use a soft brush and use a filter, blur filter, more specifically the Gaussian blur, to try to make as closely as the reference as possible. Now this is because we didn't use any blur filter when we did the first object, the metallic sphere. This is because it's more of a glossy type of object, while in this cylinder it's more of a brushed, slightly matte aluminum type of texture. And you can use overlay and use a slightly gold color and adjust the opacity from there. And that's how you make the cylinder. For our next object would be a metallic ring. Again, we will still be using references. I like to start using details first to show a distinction between the faces. And use the first shading color using an airbrush. Try to imagine where the light is coming from. From this point onwards, I started using the darkest shading color first. As from the reference, you can see the other shading colors lie within the darkest shading color. This will all depend on the references you're drawing and what type of lighting you have in the environment. As you can see, a slightly lighter shading I used over the darkest shading color to show that smooth, glossy texture of the metallic ring. Next, for the highlights, again, it shows a good contrast between the dark reflections. For the next part, I used overlay as I did previously, using a gold color from the color palette and using an airbrush. Afterwards, I try to create more detail in a separate layer. Now for the third and final object, I would be rendering or coloring a goblet. A goblet, a chalice, whatever you want to call it. I start off with the inner portion of the goblet. Now for the shading, since I'm not using a reference, I tried to shade it myself. It's really difficult to know where the second, third, and the last shading color would be. In this case, it would just be up to you. And as long as the shading makes sense, if you know what I mean. As long as it looks nice and there's good contrast, which shows that the material is metallic, then there shouldn't be a 100% specific rule you should follow, because the different materials have different styles of shading. As for the highlights, I'm experimenting with blur filters, erasing with airbrushes, all that. Next, for the lavender color, to show light from different angles. Oh, and this time I used a slightly blue color for the overlay. Next, I move on to shading the rest of the goblet. Now this part is very tricky without a reference, which is why it took me quite a while to understand what it would look like. So a tip I would try to give in the case of shading metal, the shading colors between the base color and the darkest color should not contain a high percentage of the shading, because what makes the object shine and polished, in the sense metallic, is the contrast between the highlights and the darkest shading color. The shading colors between the base color and the last shading color is to indicate that there are different elements in the reflection, different sources of light. See there, I'm adjusting the highlights, sometimes erasing with an airbrush, sometimes erasing with a hard brush. I just try to experiment which looks better. At this stage, I don't really think it looks that realistic, but try to see at the end. Now, since I don't like how the light blue looks in the overlay, I try to switch it up to a little bit of gold, following the metallic ring. Next, for the detail, bordering the middle part and the base of the goblet, try to use a detailed brush. Now you can see it does not look like the reference at all, but since we're trying to do this from scratch, it somewhat shows a metallic texture. And since you can try this with different objects as well. You can try with references first and then try without using a reference, like what I did here with the goblet. You can also merge the shadings you have done into one layer and use a liquify tool, trying to follow the reference. Now in this case, it may not look the best. This is just an experiment. You can use it if you want, but in the end, I decided not to use it. Try to make the stem of the goblet, more straight. I don't know. I think it looks better with the liquify tool. Yeah, it's all up to personal preference, and that's pretty much it for this tutorial. Thanks for watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next one.